This year, we heard a number of stories that we wanted to make sure you heard. So for the next few days, we'll be dropping short bonus material from a few guests we couldn't quite fit into the regular season, but we know you'll enjoy. On In Good Faith, we believe that all faith traditions have something to teach us about how God is working in the world and in our lives. So join us as we listen and learn and discover how speaking with people of other faiths can strengthen our own faith and even our own practice. If you're over 30, you probably remember where you were on September 11th, 2001. I was at home helping my children get ready for school when we saw the news of the first plane crashing into the Twin Towers. Now, imagine you worked in an airline flight control center that morning. Our guest today is Father Greg McBrayer, who's currently Chief Dispatcher at American Airlines Integrated Operations Control Center at DFW, where he also serves as corporate chaplain. In addition, he serves full-time as an assistant priest and pastor at St. Barnabas Anglican Church in Fort Worth. He's the chairman of the board of directors of DFW Airport Interfaith Chaplaincy and leads weekly and special worship services at DFW International Airport. On September 11th, he worked in the U.S. Airways Flight Control Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
I've been raised in the church all my life. I've been in aviation all my life as well. I've been in flight control my entire career. In the late 1980s, I was moved to Pittsburgh, where I worked at U.S. Airways Flight Control Center that ran U.S. Airways worldwide, and that's where I was working on 9/11. Up to that moment, I had pretty much compartmentalized my faith and my work. They lived in kind of different places. We didn't hear the word of God too much in a flight control center, and except occasionally in vain, I would have to say honestly. But in 1994, we did have an accident in Pittsburgh, which was really close to our flight control center. It was a U.S. air flight that crashed on approach into Pittsburgh, and it deeply affected the people that I worked with at that time. And at that time, I did start bringing in a small Bible study group into our flight control center. And it just kind of marinated there like that. It was really to bring comfort to us as we were dealing with a loss that killed everyone on board. We lost some crew members. And of course, it deeply affected our airline at the time, and especially those of us in flight control because it was so close to our office. In fact, it was less than a half a mile from the church I was serving in a lay capacity at that time. And you'd have to fast forward then. It just kind of remained in two different places right there, except for the Bible study, which is still going today, by the way. That has never stopped since 1994, which I'm proud to say that. When you move forward to 9/11, I was working at U.S. Airways. After its emergence, it was U.S. Airways at that time. At the time, we were the third largest carrier in the U.S. In fact, we had more flights in the Northeast at that time than both United and American did. But I was working that morning in the Flight Control Center. It was a beautiful day. I'll just give you a little background of what it looks like in a Flight Control Center. It was kind of a dark place, no windows, radars, computers running. Back then, printers made a little bit of noise, and pretty much a quiet place, very focused, very professional in every capacity you can imagine in what we do of moving flights, at a major airline. Went in that morning. It was a beautiful day. The whole East Coast, it was what we call a bluebird day in aviation. It was nothing but blue skies all on the whole East Coast. We got in there early, did all my flight planning. They had several flights that day that were coming out of South Florida and Central Florida up into the Northeast, into Boston, New York. Got everything flight planned, talked to all my crews, did all the briefings with them. The whole fleet launches somewhere between 5 and 6 a.m. every morning, and everyone is just streaming up the East Coast and coming off the West Coast. At about 7 a.m., we got a call from the command center in Washington, D.C., where all air traffic, overhead air traffic, is managed and monitored and in flow control programs, which you've all been a part of when you get ground delays and things like that. We got a call from the command center and said that there was a possible national security threat, that some aircraft had some breached cockpits, and that at this time this thing was starting to unravel. It wasn't very long, just a matter of moments, and the first tower was struck, and we get a call back, and we're being told at that point to put all our aircraft on the ground at the nearest suitable airport, which is, in my world, meant the airport that was directly in front of the line of flight where that flight was. And keep in mind, back at that time, and even today, even more so than then, there's about 5,000 airplanes over our heads in this country right now in the airspace above us. And so it was a monumental task that had never been done to try to put that much traffic on the ground, and so we got very busy very quickly. It went rather well as could be expected under that kind of demand to try to get everything on the ground. But at the end of that day, we really had no outside visibility of what had happened in the world. We understood that, obviously 2 aircraft had made contact at the Trade Center. We also know that one came right over our head at less than 2,000 feet, and it was the one that crashed in Shanksville. In fact, the Pittsburgh Tower evacuated during that event, and we were flexing on where we were going to evacuate our flight control center. But by then, that aircraft had already crashed over there. So I went home. It was a very busy day. It was like being in a storm. I don't remember a lot of the details other than that. But went home that night. It was a long, sleepless, prayer-filled night. I got up the next morning. I had to be at work at 4 a.m. like I do every day. Went in that flight control center the next morning and walked into an entire new life. I didn't know it was going to be a new life at that moment, but it certainly was. I walked in there, and like I said, it's a dark room, normally buzzing with activity. Even at 4 a.m., there's just an energy in there when you're talking about moving a major airline, and there's an electricity in the room. And I walked in there that morning, though, and I have never forgot the deafening silence I encountered when I walked in that room. The day before was like being in a storm, and I've often equated this to where in Scripture, if you look in 1 Kings, when Elijah was running from God, God had been calling Elijah as a prophet to serve, and he was running from God and trying to avoid him. And he's avoiding him in a cave, and he's trying to hear God in his life to direct him further in this direction. There's storms going on around him. He doesn't hear anything from God. And I felt like that's what my life had kind of been. I think God called me back in the late 90s and mid-90s around that crash when I started the Bible study, and I continued to suppress that. But when I walked in that flight control center that morning, and I was overcome by the deafening silence in that room, and I looked around in the faces of the people that I work with, which are very focused professionals. And for the first time in my life, unlike the day before when our heads are down and we're working as feverishly as we can to do an impossible task, I looked in their faces and I saw fear and uncertainty and anger that I'd never seen before. And I remember in that moment, in the stillness of that room, just thinking to myself and quietly saying, "Dear God, we need you here." And I have never forgot hearing his soft, still voice, just like Elijah did in that cave in the calm after the storm, God telling me, "Well, that's why I placed you there." And from that day forward, my whole life, the direction of my life, forever changed. I realized that God had brought me into that flight control center and had a different plan for me other than just being a flight controller in my profession. And from that day forward, I really did start stepping into a calling that I had kind of suppressed for quite some time. But at that moment, I realized that I was where I was supposed to be, and I was there to be comforting people to the challenges that we had still before us that were going to be monumental in the years to come. From that day forward, it would be a tremendous impact on all of our lives in aviation. It affected me emotionally in every other way you can imagine. It was a life-altering event. But primarily what it did was it drew me closer to the fact that God had called me years before. And once now I could finally recognize that I had a mission in this industry that I was called into that was unique. And all of a sudden, God starts opening doors and giving opportunity for me to do things that had never been done in this industry, which would eventually lead me from U.S. Airways to Dallas, Texas, to where I'm at now, to being the largest flight control center in the world, serving American as a chief flight controller and a chaplain in a role that I was called out of in the ashes of 9/11. So it was really a transformational moment in my life, in my calling. It would lead me to the completion of my seminary studies. It would lead to bivocational ministry, which is what I'm engaged in now, to serve in a very unique setting where God had uniquely equipped me to serve. And I think that it was a transformational moment, but one that I wouldn't take anything for what I've gleaned from it and through it to be able to serve at the capacity I serve today.
Many thanks to Greg McBrayer for speaking with me. Our production team includes Heather Bigley, Heidi Clough, Nick Levitt, and Ocean Marshall. Our post-production sound designer is Gabriel Haro. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. In fact, we think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. Check out more of our episodes and extended interviews on our YouTube channel and connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at In Good Faith Podcast. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join me again soon, right here in Good Faith.